in this special series of the ImanWire podcast.
There is no reading of the Quran or the Sunnah of the Prophet. There is no historical understanding of these sources that can not conclude that these sources were absolutely obsessed with emancipation, the freeing of slaves, that they encouraged it more than any other pre-modern document I've ever seen, and that it was one of the aims of the Sharia to emancipate people.
Obviously, this trauma and pain of slavery, especially in a world where all of our modern forms of oppression, exploitation, racism, capitalism, white supremacy are all tethered back to slavery. How do we fix our hearts when we see this institution being inscribed, almost like written back onto the tablets of Revelation, that we're supposed to just deal with slavery as somehow part of the Islamic legacy?
So those African Muslims saw themselves as slaves, but not slaves to the white Europeans who were Christians. They saw themselves as slaves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is what was liberatory for them. And this is what should be liberatory for us. We're slaves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And our true liberation is through this ubudiyya, through this worship.
And every single relationship the Prophet had, peace be upon him, whether these were Ummahat al-Mu'mineen, whether these were his wives or servants in the household, or people that were brought as war captives, or people who were freed, or people who were given to him as gifts. In every single relationship, time and time again, he shows us how to interact on the basis of respect and compassion and ihsan, time and time again. He never ever takes advantage or presses his advantage. Sallallahu alayhi wasallam.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the ImanWire podcast. Salim here to introduce this special series of the podcast on Islam and slavery. This is a complex topic to discuss, so to take a deeper dive into the issue and to enable different perspectives and an emphasis on different aspects of it, this is a 4-part series. The first episode with Dr. Jonathan Brown provides a broad and detailed overview of slavery in general and slavery in Muslim civilization. The second episode with Dr. Bilal Ware explores the heritage of emancipation and abolition of slavery in Islam and examines the history of the quote-unquote Muslim slave trade. In episode 3 with Imam Dawood Walid, we focus on the aftermath of slavery, in particular its role in anti-blackness in Muslim society and its influence on how we understand theology and language in the Quran. And in the 4th episode, Ustada Zainab Ansari discusses the topic of female slave concubinage. So we begin with our conversation with Dr. Jonathan Brown, Professor of Islamic Civilization at Georgetown University. Dr. Brown is the author of the book, Slavery in Islam. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Jonathan Brown. Welcome to the ImanWire podcast. How are you?
Wa alaikum salam. I'm doing fine. How are you doing?
Good, alhamdulillah. It's been a while since we've been together. For some of our listeners that are familiar with the podcast, we've had Dr. Brown on for several episodes. The last one, which is actually one of our most popular ones, was about like the authenticity of the Quran. And that was very beneficial for a lot of listeners out there. But that was like a long time ago. I mean, it was like years ago. And we were just...
I barely remember.
We were just catching up about, how we haven't seen each other, 4 or 5 years, certainly COVID. Not since pre-COVID, and it's good to sort of reconnect again. And the topic today is certainly a very controversial topic. It's a topic that you wrote a book on, and that's the topic of slavery. You wrote a book a few years ago called Slavery in Islam. Before we get into sort of the flow and the content of the book, my first question is, when we talk about slavery from a worldwide and a Muslim standpoint, slavery is not legal anywhere in the world. It's been abolished for a long time, both in the non-Muslim world and the Muslim world, not just from a political standpoint, but even all Islamic scholarship now, believes it to be prohibited, using the religion itself as a means to justify the prohibition, right? And so when we talk about slavery, the question is, well, is this a sort of a moot issue? Why even discuss this topic? Why even write a book about slavery in Islam? I'd like to hear a little bit what motivated you to decide to write this book.
I'm just curious, have people actually said that it's like a moot issue? Why are you talking about this? You actually heard people say that?
I will tell you this. I will tell you that growing up, right, when you came across things about slavery in in whether it's in the text of Islam or just in Muslim civilization. A lot of times, I'm talking like Sunday school, like say, slavery doesn't exist anymore. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I mean, I think that's actually an interesting response from you, because I think that actually was the kind of status quo. That was the situation for many years. I think I became Muslim in 1997. And I mean, I remember reading, there's a chapter, it's a verse in Surah An-Nahl that talks about God gives you the parable of Abdun mamlukun la yaqdiru ala shay, right? So the kind of the comparison between a slave who's owned and has no capacity versus somebody who is able to spend their money and in the path of God. So it's like it's a parable about the difference between somebody who has no power and someone who has a capacity. But and what I remember, I remember where I was when I read this. I was in my old room in the house I grew up in. I was reading the translation of the Quran, like lying on my bed. I remember thinking, I was like, this is really weird, because I mean, it's not like addressing the issue of slavery. It's literally like bringing up slavery as a analogy for something else. And then it's not saying, oh, by the way, like slavery is wrong. And so I was kind of, taken aback by that, to the extent that I remember it. And, I think I just sort of like basically shoved it under like mental carpet or something. And I think that's what I think that was a kind of standard operating procedure for a lot of Muslims, not just in the US, but I think a lot of Muslims around the world, is just to sort of say like, okay, well, it's not really relevant. We don't really, let's talk about something else. Or you hear some kind of platitude given, usually sometimes inaccurate, ends up being inaccurate platitude. So I think that was really how the issue was dealt with. And, for better or for worse, but that didn't really work after the rise of ISIS, because suddenly, this weird movement in the Middle East was like taking slave women, and saying then, this is part of the Sharia and it's completely allowed. And why are you guys shocked by this? And Muslims kind of globally didn't really have much of a response, except to say like, this isn't allowed anymore or something. But I mean, you didn't really have an answer. Like, okay, well, you read about this in the Quran. Like Muslims, you read the Quran every day. You see mention of slavery. So what do you... like, what's your answer to this? And people didn't really have an answer. You saw kind of different efforts to respond, but I thought a lot of them were, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to criticize them. I would just say that I think that it was very difficult for people to either respond or be convinced by the responses. Mm-hmm. And so that's when I decided, I need to answer my own questions about this, and I need to answer other people's questions, and I'm going to do both through trying to research this topic. I mean, prior to this, I was not like a scholar of history of slavery. I'm an Islamic intellectual historian. I mean, I knew the Islamic intellectual tradition very well. I knew about, slavery and Islamic civilization, but to try and tackle this, and I think the comprehensive way it has to be tackled to really address the questions I had, that was a whole new scholarly journey for me, which took a lot of work. But I mean, I became kind of obsessed with the topic. I think I remember it was December of 2016. That's when I started researching on it. And I just went, obsessively for maybe 2 years or so to write the book. And and I would just say that, when I say you have to answer it comprehensively, is what I mean by that is, I think a good analogy is terrorism, right? Mm-hmm. The idea of terrorism. So, like, you and I can sit and debate. It's actually interesting because it's actually not as bad as it used to be. I think nowadays there's people are a lot more kind of epistemologically critical and skeptical about when the U.S. government comes and says so-and-so is terrorist or something like that. But I mean, imagine kind of going back into like the 2000s or the 2010s or something, when there was, it was a lot it was not really acceptable to, if someone said someone's a terrorist, you couldn't really be like, well, are they really a terrorist? You would be immediately condemned for that. But I think that's a very good analogy for the slavery issue, because, you can't really talk about slavery, right? You can't really, if I say, so-and-so is a slave and so-and-so is a slave owner, the moral setting is unquestionable, right? So the slave is a person who's persecuted unjustly. It's unconscionable. It's unacceptable. It's morally evil. The slave owner is engaged in this moral evil, right? You can't say, is that slave being treated well or not well? Is that, does the slave want to be a slave? I mean, just even me saying this right now, it's like uncomfortable. Response. Even it's uncomfortable to say it, right? So, but like if you think about it, and I remember there was this podcast I was listening to a few years ago. It was by an American academic, a scholar who studies slavery in the Americas, in the U.S. And she was talking about how it was about the kind of urban slavery in the pre-Civil War South versus like slaves who were working in agricultural settings. And the host asked the scholar, like, well, what was the condition of the conditions that the urban slaves lived in? And she said, well, the conditions were, and then she stopped herself. She said, I almost said the conditions were better, but out of principle, I can't say that anything is better or worse in slavery. Like the idea that you would talk about someone being treated better or worse is sort of an affront to the way that we think about slavery as being this absolute and unconscionable moral evil across space and time, where you can't draw distinctions of kind or degree, because
it's like a binary.
It's like saying, yeah, Hitler was bad, but sometimes he was like, could be a nice guy, or like, he actually had a good sense of humor. So I'm just making this up, right? But the idea, like, you can't do that, right? So, but you can also immediately see the problem here, which is there actually are different distinctions in types of slavery, right? So there can be a slave owner who treats his slaves extremely nicely, and his slaves like that person, and maybe they are happy with their lives. Maybe they'd rather be free, but they're not, unhappy, right? And you can have someone who's a horrible, horrible slave owner, like in 12 Years a Slave or something like that. So, I mean, if we can't talk about the differences between these two situations, then we're really, in some ways, handicapped morally. And that is especially true when you're talking about slavery in world history. So if you're talking about the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, let's say in the 1500s, who's a slave, technically he's a slave, but he's the richest and most powerful person in the empire after the Sultan.
And he's a slave.
And he's technically a slave, right? So, I mean, and lives in a palace and has like millions and millions of dollars, and he's married to the daughter of the Sultan and everything. And he's going and leading armies and having power over life and death and finances and all this stuff. I mean, if you're saying we can't compare his condition to that of like a field hand in pre-Civil War South Carolina, that's not really where we're not really able to function, I guess, morally sensitive people in that, because clearly these situations are different. We have to be able to discuss that. So what I meant when I talk about comprehensive engagement with the issue is, you can't just say, let's talk about slavery in Islamic civilization, or let's talk about slavery in the Islamic law. You have to actually first start by asking, when we talk about slavery, what do we mean? Why do we feel the way we do about slavery? What do our presuppositions entail about what we're bringing to the table as our prior commitments? What assumptions are baked into those prior commitments? So that was what I did in the book, is really comprehensively look at the issue, not just look at Islam, slavery and Islamic civilization, but to go going from like first principles about what do we mean when we talk about slavery? What happens when you define something? So yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. So that is one of the things that I noticed in the beginning of the book. You spent a long time discussing different definitions of slavery, sometimes with a capital S, sometimes with quotes. Talk a little bit about some of how we define slavery, because we've already mentioned that just using the word slave, or saying the word slave owner, it immediately directs us 100% to a specific image, right? But then, as you describe in terms of how you define even the word slave, I mean, there's different definitions that are offered, and it seems that
a lot of what slavery or how we conceive of slavery is that, as you mentioned in one of the examples, is that it's slavery. We just know it. We just see it and we know it. If you could talk a little bit about in terms of how the definition of slavery, why this matters in terms of how we in this discussion.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's really helpful to go back and think about what we do when we define things. I mean, think about this. Like, imagine actually Ibn Taymiyyah is a very interesting scholar in this regard, because he makes he objects to kind of a lot of aspects of kind of Greco-Roman or Aristotelian logic, the same kind of logic that we use today when we're trying to think kind of rigorously about things or scientifically. One of his objections is he says definition doesn't really do anything. Like, definition doesn't give you knowledge, right? So imagine this. Like, imagine we're trying to define dog. Mm-hmm. What is a dog? We could say, like, a dog is it's like a small mammal. It's furry. It has 4 legs, walks on 4 legs. It has a snout. It pants to cool itself. It is digitigrade, right? Meaning it walks on its toes, not on its flat part of its feet. And, it's carnivore, right? Okay, so we could say that's a dog, right? And then we see something that's like a wolverine or something. Mm-hmm. And we're like, well, that's not a dog. So we need to change the definition so that wolverine's out and things that we know are dogs are in. But if you think about it, what we're doing is we're actually adjusting the definition based on what we already know dogs are, right? We already know what dogs are. Mm-hmm. And then, and so we adjust the definition to exclude things we know aren't dogs and include things we know are dogs. So what's the definition really doing? Definition is just formalizing, or at least attempting to formalize what we already know dogs are, right? So we know dogs when we see them, and then we pick a definition that includes that, right? Or that is exclusive to that. So when we talk about definitions of slavery, and this is something that scholars have been engaged in since the time of Aristotle, if not earlier, and really intensively in, let's say, the last 200 years of kind of scholars trying to, historically and through the development of the social sciences, talk about slavery in world history. What people are doing is they come from different perspectives. Some of them might come from like a legal scholar perspective. Some of them might come from a kind of Marxist social science perspective. Some of them might come from I'd say those are probably the 2 main ones. And then what they're trying to do is kind of fit everything into slavery that they think slavery is, and then exclude what isn't slavery. But here's the problem. When you're talking about slavery in world history, you have a huge variety of human relationships and phenomena, right? Mm-hmm. You're assuming there is something called slavery in world history, like that's always there, or
something uniform,
constant throughout history, mm-hmm. right? First of all, that's an assumption. Mm-hmm. And then what are you looking for in world history to act as your examples by which you define this thing? You're picking what looks like slavery to you, right? So you're the kind of, it seems like this scientific endeavor, but in reality, it's kind of a projection of different Western historical ideas about slavery and assumptions, and then just kind of projecting them onto world history, and or kind of the diversity of the world today, and then trying to arrive at some definition that is going to work throughout space and time. But a lot of it is just it's just trying to include things that look like slavery to us and exclude things that don't look like slavery to us. There's some scholars, it's a minority of scholars who study this, but who say that there is kind of no trans-historical definition of slavery that works. Like there's nothing shared in human history that we can just refer to as slavery and have a consistent meaning or useful meaning. The majority of scholars would say we can come up with definitions for slavery that work throughout space and time, but there's a huge diversity in what those definitions are, right? So some of them are based on things like freedom versus not freedom. Some of them are based on ideas of ownership What does it mean when someone becomes property or is considered property? Some of them are based on ideas of like marginalization, that, that slaves are kind of the most marginalized people and most vulnerable people in a society. Some of them are based on the idea of coercion, that slavery is a condition of when you're coerced to work for little or no compensation. These are all, good definitions in particular contexts. I think the problem is that they don't really work through if you project them backwards in time, right? Mm-hmm. So when we talk about if you want, let's say define slavery in American history, it's very easy to do, right? We have American law, we have American experience, right? So you're talking about a relatively small kind of domain.
And it's typically that's what we project on every discussion.
If you want to talk about slavery, even in like, let's say Roman law, Roman legal, it's very easy to do. Islamic law, it's very easy to do, pretty easy to do, right? But once you talk about slavery in world history, then it becomes much more difficult. Even describing, if you say, it's when someone's a property. Well, how do you define property? Mm-hmm. It's when someone's not free. How do you define not free? You could define that in like America, but it's very hard to do it in world, globally or across space and time. So now one could say, well, Professor Brown, you're doing all this like whataboutism, we can't define this. Yeah. That's actually not what I'm doing, because the problem is, right, it's not, again, I'm not saying there's no such thing as slavery. Of course there's such a thing as slavery, right? I'm just trying to say that it's very easy to talk about slavery in, let's say, American history, but it's much harder to try and come up with a definition that works for other civilizations in other times. And what starts happening is that you begin projecting your own moral assumptions, your own ideas of a tradition or a phenomenon onto other people who have totally different experiences, right? Now, that's not, for example, study of religion, academic study of religion. There's actually no agreed upon definition of religion in religious studies in Western academy.
Okay.
That doesn't mean religion doesn't exist. That doesn't mean you can't study religion, which means that people have competing ideas about what exact, for example. So, there's a whole like people who talk about, let's say, college football in Tennessee or like Ohio State as like they actually treat this as like a religious experience and they study it. And someone goes, that's not religion. What are you talking about? Someone goes, well, actually it is religion. Okay. So we're defining about whether this should be religion, just debating whether this should be a religious experience or not. Fine. There's a big difference though, because when you talk about slavery, it's a matter of being morally acceptable or morally repugnant, right? So if we decide that University of Ohio State University, what is it? Ohio State University. Ohio State, right. If their college football is like a religion or not, whatever. But if we say that, Ohio State University has slaves or not, that's the difference between Ohio State University being like a morally acceptable participant in public life versus Ohio State University being an morally abhorrent criminal, right? A moral and legal criminal, right? So it's a big difference. It's like the difference between being a terrorist and not a terrorist. So if we decide that such and such an organization is not a terrorist organization or such and such a terrorist organization is a terrorist organization, that's a huge difference. That's extremely consequential.
Because using the term basically infers a specific moral condemnation.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, definitely. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's really important, because what I want to argue in this chapter is we can see through all these different definitions of slavery, like just for example, just for your listeners' sake, right? So let's talk about freedom. Mm-hmm. What is freedom? Freedom is the ability to do whatever you want, except if it's illegal. Okay, but then what's the difference? Freedom in one country is going to be different from another country because different things are going to be allowed and not allowed. Right. Property. What's the definition of property? Property is the most extreme form of the legal right to control over something that somebody can have. But that's going to differ from time to time and place to place. What's coercion? What constitutes coercion? What constitutes marginalization, right? You, again, in any given context, you can come up with good definitions for this, but to talk about it globally and transhistorically, that's very difficult. So My point is, when you're doing this, we have to watch out because we're importing a lot of our Western assumptions, American assumptions into these discussions. And not only that, but you can see this very clearly in the debates over like modern day slavery.
Right. Yeah.
Where, if you look at what's called the new abolitionist movement, new abolitionists, people who are trying to fight against modern day slavery. For people who talk about modern day slavery, this is not a metaphor. This is actually slavery in their opinion, right? This is actual legal slavery. This is actually a phenomenon called slavery, not a metaphor. In 2006, let's say one really famous guy, I won't mention him, but a very famous scholar on this, he talked about prisoners in American jails. He said, these are not prisoners. These are not slaves, sorry. The same scholar today, or at least as a couple of years ago, was like looking into this, reconsidering this, whether prisoners in American jails are slaves or not. Their conditions have not changed.
Right.
What changed is the political acceptability or kind of fashionability of talking about people in jail, in prisons being slaves. Like now it's to the point where even in movies like Thor Ragnarok and things like that, there's the Grand Master character by Jeff Goldblum. He makes it, says like this, they say the slaves are escaping, sir. He's like, no, don't say that word. Yeah. They're sorry, the prisoners with jobs are escaping. So even in Hollywood now, it's kind of cool to talk about, you're so socially aware and conscious of justice issues that you acknowledge that people in American prisons are actually slaves. Nothing's changed except just the political environment about whether or not it's acceptable to say this. So you can see how much of this discussion about who's a slave and who's not a slave in world history is going to be potentially impacted just by our own political environment. Like whose suffering do we want to kind of evaluate? Whose suffering do we want to ignore?
Right, exactly.
Whose oppression do we want to register? Whose oppression do we want to consider normal, right? So that's one of the point I try to make in that chapter.
Yeah, I mean, and then you start moving on into sort of the Muslim realm. If we could talk about a little bit, what was the definition, or was there a definition of what a slave was in the early Islamic tradition? And then we can get into sort of the authoritative sources, the Quran and the prophetic period, in terms of what exactly that Islamic type of, we'll call it riq, just to be not, we're talking about terms in terms of what that meant.
I mean, the first thing to keep in mind is that slavery in the pre-modern period was, omnipresent. I mean, it was just every civilization that we know of had something that we would see as slavery. Most societies, most human societies in history have had something we would consider slavery. This is very important as well. No society that had slaves abolished slavery prior to, as far as I know, prior to the early modern period, prior to essentially like the let's just go maybe the 1700s. That would be maybe the earliest we can imagine it. Just imagine that. So not only that, by the way, this is very important. If you won't go and search through like the human heritage, as far as I know, for people who say that slavery, qua slavery per se, not slavery that's excessive, not slavery of the enslavement of the wrong people, not treating slaves badly. I mean, just slavery qua slavery. That slavery qua slavery is an inherent evil. The number of people, I don't mean the number of schools of thought, I mean the number of actual individuals who say this prior to, let's put a date, 1690, is about 3 or 4 people. I mean 3 or 4 individuals. Just imagine that. Every philosophical school, every religion, every kind of moral tradition either defended slavery, had no problem with slavery, excused slavery, or considered it uncontroversial. So this is just very important to keep in mind.
in whatever form it was
so
taking place in those where those traditions emerged.
This is not. I'm not making some special pleading case here. I mean, this is undeniable. And if someone comes and so, well, what about Spartacus? Spartacus wasn't trying to end slavery. Spartacus and his followers, they didn't want to be slaves. They took their own slaves. Oh, people say, well, what about the Zanj rebellion in the Abbasid Iraq in the 800s? Yeah, they didn't want to be slaves. They enslaved the people they conquered, right? So they're not even, there's not some proto-abolitionist movement. Okay. So when we talk about Islamic civilization or the Quran, the Sunnah, for example, the existing understandings of slavery in the Near East were the basis of slavery in Islam, right? So the Quran doesn't say, verily, there's this thing called slavery. Mm-hmm. Let me tell you what it is, right? The Prophet doesn't say, let me tell you what slavery is. It's just part of life. It would be like saying, I don't need to tell you what a chair is, right? I can tell you what you can do with a chair. I can tell you what not to do with a chair, but I don't sit now. There's things called chairs and we sit. This is like slavery was a reality in the life of. Right. And this is not just in Arabia. This was everywhere for all of human history pretty much until the 1700s. Okay. So there's certain things about slavery in Arabia was, at the time of the Prophet, was, first of all, most of the slaves were Arab. The largest group, not most of, but the largest group of slaves in Arabia were other Arabs, captured on raids, or bought in a slave market, having previously been captured on a raid. The second largest groups were Ethiopians, maybe East Africa, people from the Horn of Africa, and Persians. You also had Byzantine, sort of Aramaic or Greek-speaking Byzantines, and then there were some Indians. Slaves were widespread in Arabia, like they were everywhere, but they were not a big part of the economy. It wasn't like, let's say, the Roman Empire or the American South. They were kind of people that you would have to help you out doing stuff, but they were not an essential part of the economy. There's certain things about slavery in that Islam just adopts. For example, that it exists. Other things like slavery coming through the mother. This is in Roman law. It's in pre-Islamic Near Eastern law. It's in Jewish law, right? Which is that if you have a slave woman and she has a child, that child will be a slave and will belong to the owner of the woman. This is, again, this is brought in directly into the Islamic tradition. And Muslim scholars like Shafi say, this actually doesn't go along with other ideas in our religion because, for example, your name and my name are our father's last names or our father's names. Right? So similarly, our religion, like if our mothers were Christian or something, and our dads were Muslim, we'd be Muslim, at least according to Islamic law. So Shafi says, like, actually, this goes against the general rule in Islam, which is that things come through your father patrilineally. But he says, this is just an existing tradition. Now, Islam, the Quran, and the Sunnah of the Prophet make some very marked changes to this. Okay, another thing I should add, by the way, is the main way that people become slaves in the Near East prior to Islam, the main way is either capture or debt. You're in debt to someone, you can't pay them, so you become their slave. Self-dedition. What does that mean? People give themselves into slavery. So why would somebody do that? Because imagine you're really poor and you're dying of starvation or something. And you say, listen, I'll be your slave, just feed me, feed my family. People would do this. Selling your own children into slavery. Someone might say, well, what kind of monster does that? Maybe someone who doesn't care about their kids. But also, if your child is going to die of starvation and someone else is willing to at least feed that child, you might do this. So Islamic law closes all these doors except for capture. So the only way that someone can become a slave, according to the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet, is if you are captured by Muslims, you're not a Muslim, you're a non-Muslim, categorized Muslims outside the abode of Islam. So if you're like a Jewish person living under Muslim rule, or a Christian person living under Muslim rule, or a Yazidi person living under Muslim rule, you cannot be enslaved.
Because you're a
dhimmi,
right. Okay.
One of the people who Muslims are protected minorities. So that's the only way. You can't sell yourself into slavery. You can't be a debt slave. You can't sell your children into slavery, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so this is very important. That's one big change. It closes off all the routes into slavery except capture and warfare. Now, by the way, most slaves in Islamic history are not captured. They're bought. What does that mean? If I go to the slave market in Baghdad and some merchant brings 500 Russian or Slavic peasants from south of Russia to sell, then I'm just like, these people are already enslaved. They're pre-enslaved, right? So I can buy them because they're already slaves. There is, by the way, a debate amongst Muslim scholars about whether or not that merchant should have bought those slaves, right? So let's say I'm that merchant, I'm in southern Russia, like the city of Bulgar or something on the Volga River, and this guy comes up and says, I've got a bunch of slaves here for you or something, And you're like, who are these people? I mean, so one argument, which ends up being the majority argument, is if it's okay in that society, if those people sell themselves into slavery, sell their kids into slavery, if their chiefs sell them into slavery, whatever, if they're brought to you acceptably as slaves in that society, you can purchase them. That becomes a majority position. And it's oddly enough very culturally sensitive because you're not imposing your views on those other people. But it's also very practical because how are Muslim scholars supposed to know exactly what other people are doing or whatever? But the minority view is no. The only way that someone can, because they say that it's illegal to give yourself or your children or your relatives or your subject into slavery, even if you're not Muslim. So that position is actually more morally kind of demanding, but it ends up losing out, I think, just because it was kind of impractical. But it was kind of a tangent. But let's go back to like the other major change that Islam introduces. The second one is an repeated and fervent emphasis on emancipation, freeing slaves. The idea that there's this religious duty to free slaves, which appears in the Quran over and over again, and appears in the Sunnah of the Prophet even more commonly, even more frequently. That is, you see this a bit in pre-Islamic traditions of Christianity, even Roman philosophy, but the extent to which it appears in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet is unprecedented. Second, the Quran ties freeing slaves to expiation of certain sins. If you commit certain sins, if you break certain types of oaths, you have to free a slave, or you should free a slave. It allocates one of the people who can receive zakat are slaves who are trying to buy their own freedom. The Quran also either encourages or requires, depending how you understand it, slave owners to agree if their slave wants to engage in a contract to purchase their own freedom, right? So this appears in the Quran, notion of mukataba, which is that a slave says, I want to basically buy my freedom on installments from you. That the owner is either required or strongly recommended to agree. This is also Quranic.
Which is interesting because if for those scholars who stated that it was required, it was an inversion of the power dynamic, because it's almost as if the slave is over the master. So is basically saying, So the reason why it's not required, according to most Muslim scholars, is for two reasons. One, the Quran says, I think it's in ra'ayta fihim khair, I think is the verse, right? So if you see good in them, so it says, do this agreement if you see that good in this person. So it creates a condition. So let's say you have a slave who's not going to be able to support themselves, who's going to end up homeless and begging in the streets. Then it would be bad for you to do this mukataba agreement because this person's not able to take care of themselves.
So it introduces an element of discretion for the
Right.
owner.
Okay.
The second, as you said, is that some Muslim scholars said, wait a second, like, how can you have a slave owner who's forced to do something that the slave wants? That kind of broke with their legal logic around the institution. I'm not saying what's right or wrong. I'm just describing it. So the first thing is closing all the doors into enslavement, except for capture and warfare or raiding. The second one is fervent and vociferous emphasis on manumission of slaves and creating a either requirement or scriptural encouragement for this. And then the third is very unusual, right? In the sense that it's a total departure from what you would have expected in the Near East prior to Islam. So under Christianity, which had become the dominant religion in the kind of East, what would it be? Kind of Eastern Mediterranean world, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Anatolia. The church had started to sort of funnel all types of sexual relationship into marriage, into monogamous marriage. Right? This is based on kind of Roman understandings of Christianity. So under Roman law previously, you couldn't marry your slave if you were a free person. You couldn't marry a slave. It said, under kind of Christianized law, it said, listen, if you're going to have sex with your slave, you have to be married to her. Or it doesn't matter. You can marry you can only have sex with someone you're married to, and if that person's a slave or not, doesn't matter. So there was a kind of move towards monogamy and marriage. So only sex was only allowed in marriage and had to be monogamous. That doesn't mean this is actually what happened in practice. It means this is like the direction of the law. The Muslim community, and this isn't mentioned in the Quran or the Sunnah of the Prophet, but it's just agreed upon from the very beginning of Islam, as far as we know. It takes like a hard right turn. Hard turn in one direction or the other. I don't want to make it political implication here. So, you actually can be married and have female slaves with whom you have sex if you're a man. And this is the big change as well, which is that children born of that union or of that relationship are, one, legally free. Two, they are legitimate, right? So they inherit from you. Three, they have the same social standing as your children born from a wife. This is unprecedented in the world, as far as I know, and certainly in the Near East, which is, prior to this, if someone had, think about Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson had all these children with his slave, Sally Heming. Those children were slaves. Those children were black, according to American understandings. Those children were in a social underclass, right? Their father was part of the elite. They were not. If Thomas Jefferson if this had been a situation in Islamic law and Islamic civilization, those children would be free. Those children would be legitimate. Those children would have the same social standing as their father. So they would be like the next president, or they would be part of the elite. So that is a huge change, and that's unprecedented in the Near East and and wider world, as far as I know. So those are the big changes that Islam brings. And
also, in terms of the conduct one has with slaves, could you talk a little bit about what the Prophet ﷺ described?
Yeah. So there's obviously a lot of teachings from the Prophet ﷺ that you should treat your slave as you would treat your brother or your sister. You have to feed them from the same food you eat, clothe them from the same clothes you wear. You can't overburden them with work. When they pray with you, they're your brother or they're your sister. If you strike them and it draws blood, that you should free them. That you're all slaves of God, and there's only one Lord, which is the the God, right? The one God, and God has more power over you than you have over your slave. So there's a lot of ethical exhortations towards, moderate treatment of slaves and not overworking them, not mistreating them. I mean, just as an example of this, if you look at, let's say, major Christian preachers in the 500s, for example, in places like Constantinople, the way that they're teaching people to treat slaves, this, don't beat your slave, don't whip them more than like 30 or 40 times or something. That's actually that's above the realm of what a lot of Muslim scholars would say is allowed for criminals. That's like according to some schools of law, that's getting up into the realm of like maximum lashes for criminals who've committed non-had offenses. So the way that slave owners were allowed to discipline their slaves was significantly less than, was significantly more restrained than what Christian scholars around the same time were advocating for their flocks. So I think that's, of course, that doesn't mean that some Muslim slave owners weren't awful people. Right. But just in terms of what the ethical,
in terms of, I think like the original sources, which we're particularly concerned with. We'll get into the Muslim practice of slavery over time in a moment. I thought it was interesting, in terms of, and this is sort of a segue as we move into sort of the Muslim practice of slavery versus the Quranic prophetic ideal, which I think you've summarized pretty well. In terms of the zeal for manumission, you describe about this drive in this period of as Muslims are developing their codes of law, this drive towards emancipation, manumission of slaves, to the level where if you compare it to other, say property or other elements, like they would take things like, for example, if someone in jest would say like, you're free, like some would even say like, well, no, that slave is free. Or that if there was, as you were talking about, any type of abuse or harm that would come to, that would be a grounds for them to be freed. I thought that was very interesting to see that there was this zeal to try to give the benefit of the doubt for freeing a slave versus like other categories or other situations in law.
Yeah, the impetus to free slaves is very strong and very old. So it goes, you can see it in texts going back to like the earliest texts that have survived in the Islamic tradition, aside from the Quran, which is, things like the notion that God wants freedom. Mm-hmm. God. So it's interesting that
so there was an understanding, I think, if I'm hearing you right, that for a lot of the Muslim scholars and people, like there was an understanding that this is not a desirable condition.
Yeah. So a couple of things. One is that it's a theologically problematic condition, right? So the way that the Quran talks about humans a lot of the time is as ibadullah, right, slaves of God. By the way, this is not just Quranic. Like if you go into the Old Testament or the New Testament, the words that, if you listen to someone reading like the Gospels or something, it'll talk about, servants of God. That's actually slaves, right? So the notion that the slaves, that believers in God, that human beings are slaves of God, willingly or unwillingly, is very common in the kind of Abrahamic tradition. So if you're a slave of God, if you and I are slaves of God, it's sort of weird to say that you're my slave too, because wait, am I like God? I don't understand. So it becomes, if everybody's a slave of God, how do you have someone who's a slave of another person? This is why the Prophet says, alayhi salam, he says, do not call your slaves my slave, call them my boy or my girl. And slaves, do not call your owner my master, call them my mawla, my kind of guardian or something, or my patron. Because he wants to clarify that the social and human economic and social phenomenon of slavery is distinct from the notion of slavery towards God, to being a slave of God, right? He wants to remove the theological elements from this social relationship or economic relationship. The second thing is, as you said, all humans, one of the assumptions, the basic legal assumptions in Islamic law is that all humans are born free. So humans, the default assumption for humans is that they're free. You can only become not free if you're enslaved, or you become a slave, become slave illegally, according to Islamic law. So, for example, a Muslim can never be a slave. Mm-hmm. Even if I'm captured by a Martian, like Martian slaver or something like that, according to Islamic law, I'm still free. I might be, in terms of reality, I might be a slave to this Martian master, but I'm actually legally, from the Sharia, I'm still free because I cannot be enslaved as a Muslim. So it's interesting that when you look at the definition of slavery, Muslims don't really come up with their own definition of slavery very early. The earliest I've seen them do it is in like the 900s. And the definition of slavery is slavery is a legal handicap that is caused by unbelief. So you're an unbeliever, you're enslaved, you have a legal handicap caused by that unbelief, now we'll get into what that legal handicap is in a second. But what happens, let's say, if that guy has a child or that woman has a child, that person's a slave, but they were born Muslim. Let's say the parent converted. So that person was never an unbeliever. How is it that they're a slave? Well, Muslim jurists would say, well, that's like a vestige of their parents' unbelief, which is not a very good argument, right. But they were trying their best. Now, the actual legal handicap is just a combination of the different rulings that we have from the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet about what slaves can't do that free people can. So, for example, a slave, according to most schools of law, a slave cannot be a notary, like they cannot bear witness to contracts, whereas a free person can. A slave, according to most schools of law, a slave can't own property, whereas a free person can. A slave doesn't have to do Hajj. A slave doesn't have to pay zakat, right? So if you take these different kind of rulings that adhere in a slave, that collection together is the definition of slavery. Mm-hmm. Now, the final point I would make, which you alluded to earlier, is although neither Muslim scholars nor almost anybody else in human history that I know of said that slavery is a moral evil or wrong in and of itself. They couldn't say that, right? Because God allowed it. And if God allows it, how can it be wrong, right? So but they did always acknowledge that slavery is harmful. They said it is darar, it is harm. Right. Why? How do they know it's harmful? They know it's harmful because the Prophet ﷺ and the Quran are repeatedly
over and over again
urging people to free their slaves. Why would they do that if it was desirable, right? So it's harmful, and Muslim scholars write this very explicitly, because if slaves can't do what they want, they can't make their own choices in every regard, they can't control the fruits of their labor, they're not a complete legal person, right? They don't have the same legal requirements and obligations that a free Muslim has. So this is what they're saying, like this, slavery is harmful, but it was a harm that for them was a kind of unquestioned reality of human life. Yeah, just as it was for all civilizations that had this phenomenon, which is that it was part of life. And I would just preface probably what you're going to ask next by saying that it's very interesting that people don't really start to question that reality. The idea that you have people to do work for you and move things for you and serve you and do work, domestic and agricultural work. They don't really start to question this until, lo and behold, they discover that you can take fossil fuels and burn them and create steam power and have machines do that work. Then suddenly you start having widespread discussions about the moral evil of slavery, when suddenly you don't have a requirement anymore to have people and animals.
It's interesting you mentioned fossil fuels, because Justin Parrott from Yaqeen, he has a good analogy in terms of understanding sort of the ubiquitousness of slavery in the pre-modern world. is akin to basically our use of fossil fuels, right? Like hundreds of years from now, people are going to look at this era and be like, why did they ever use fossil fuels? Because of all the harms, and it's because it's so intrinsic to everything that we. Everything is based on the consumption of fossil fuels, the current economic world, and that's moving in a certain direction, right? But it's it'd be as if like to sort of looking back on it, it's easy for someone to say like, why would they ever have used these? But living in the reality that we are now, and it's shifting, it's so intrinsic to everything that the way the world operates. So I just as a sidebar, just when you mentioned that as sort of but yes, we're talking about as we move towards the further into the Muslim history and into the modern history in terms of the movement towards abolition. But before getting into that, we talked a little bit about what riq is in terms of the Islamic idealization as it is in the Quran and the prophetic model. And just one other comment I wanted to make was I'm always amazed that, as is reported in some of the last words that the Prophet ﷺ said in this world, was the prayer and the ones who you possess with your right hand, meaning the slave. It's very, very interesting that this was something of such showing the import of how you're describing the importance of conduct or the seriousness of that relationship.
I mean, I would say that the Quran certainly places a large emphasis on freeing slaves, but the hadith corpus is obsessed with freeing slaves. And I mean that like literally there's an obsession in the reports from the Prophet ﷺ about the obligation to free slaves, the encouragement to free slaves, and the good treatment of slaves. Now, what's fascinating is someone could say, well, people made these hadiths up. Okay, but then they made up hadiths about the obligation to free slaves and the encouragement to free slaves and to treat slaves well. So actually, one of the most interesting things, I thought this was really fascinating in my book, and I encourage other people to do this if they want to study this, is to just look in the books of forged hadith. So Muslim scholars, beginning in the 1000s, start to produce books, collections of hadiths that they believe are forged. And if you look in those books, the hadiths that are forged about freeing slaves, they're kind of outrageous. Some of them are just ridiculous. There's one which is one of the longest quote unquote hadiths anywhere. It's a forgery, but it's extremely long. And in it, you see how much freeing slaves is a part of the kind of moral universe of Islamic thought, because it uses the freeing of a slave as a kind of a unit of currency for measuring good deeds. So it'll say every step you take to the mosque is the equivalent, like when it's time to pray, is equivalent of freeing 100 slaves. So it's the forged hadiths on freeing slaves are fascinating to look, because it shows you whoever's making these things up, they're also motivated by this same ethos or kind of impetus of a duty and an urge to manumit.
And I think this leads us into sort of the we'll try to give a broad overview of some of the Muslim practice of slavery after the early period. But as you describe, one of the things I like about in your book is you give different examples in the chapter talking about slavery in Muslim civilization, of just the diverse expression of how slavery was in different places, right? You were talking earlier about how slavery was in one way in the Roman Empire, in one way, say, in another area, but even within the Islamic lands, it was such an immense diversity, as you described. Even within the Ottoman Empire, there was such a diversity, right? And in your discussion of sort of the diversity of expressions of the expression of slavery, you also describe talking about the zeal for emancipation was almost like a double-edged sword, because there was such a impetus to free slaves because of the importance of slavery in the world economy, and that includes the Muslim world. There was a need to still have slaves in those lands. So Muslims were freeing a lot of slaves, but that actually spurred an increase of trying to acquire more slaves to replace the ones that they just freed. And so hence a lot of the slaves that were in the the Muslim lands, it wasn't because of prisoners of war. It was actually from importing slaves from outside the lands of Islam to fill that need. Which is I think very interesting in understanding sort of the trajectory of slavery in the Muslim world.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple of things about slavery in Islamic civilization. Obviously, Islamic civilization is very big and very, very big area over a very long period of time. So you're always going to be talking in the realm of generalizations. But there are accurate generalizations and there are inaccurate generalizations. So let's try and do, only indulge in accurate generalizations. One accurate generalization is that slavery in Islamic civilization was very infrequently agricultural slavery. Slaves were not often used for agricultural work as we see in the Americas and the Caribbean.
Plantation slavery.
Yeah. Second, probably the largest single use was domestic slaves. So people who would work in households. So if you imagine a city like Baghdad or Cairo or Istanbul, these people would be everywhere in life, in people's as maids, as people guards, as people doing errands for you, as commercial agents, people running your shop. So let's say you're a middle class shop owner in Istanbul in 1500, right? So you have, you're not rich, but you're not poor. You're doing pretty well for yourself. You have one slave woman who's cleaning the house and cooking, and one who takes care of your kids, helps you. One who helps you with your shop. So he's there when you're not there. You send him out to do errands. Maybe you trust him enough that you start to send him like, okay, I'm going to send you to Bursa. You're going to go on this couple day trip to Bursa. You're going to buy 50, reams of silk or something, and come and bring them back. And it's up to you. I trust you to negotiate a good price. And here's your letter from me saying that you're my agent, stuff like that. This is very common. It's called a me'dhun, a slave who has the right to basically be a commercial agent. So you have, then, by the way, who's the army that is defending your city of Istanbul is the most powerful units of that army are slave soldiers. They're the janissaries, right? They are technically slaves of the Sultan. The senior administration of the empire are slave administrators who are very powerful, but who are technically slaves of the Sultan. So you can just see the variety just in your city of, then, meanwhile nearby, the big Suleymaniye Mosque is being built by Suleiman. Sultan Suleiman has ordered this mosque to be built. Who's building the mosque? Some of the workers are free workers. Some of them are slaves. Let's say, again, sorry to implicate you in this, but you're doing so well this year in your shop that you've bought another slave who's let's say an Italian who's been captured in a naval battle. And he's really good kind of with ropes and woodwork and stuff like that. And you're like, okay, listen, you go and you're going to work building the Suleymaniye Mosque. You give me 80% of your wages. When you come back, you keep 20%. And when you've reached, let's say in 5 years, you've reached this amount of money, you'll be free. We'll do a mukataba agreement. So that guy goes, he's working every day. Next to free labor is building the mosque. This is accurate, by the way. The Suleymaniye Mosque was built in exactly this way. So they're both getting paid the same amount of wages by whoever's running the project construction. The free worker goes home and does whatever. This guy comes back to you, gives you 80% of what he makes. So this slave is actually investment for you. So you're making money, having him go out, farming him out to work. And then he's going to earn his freedom in, let's say, 5 or 6 years. This is very common. The description I just gave you is a very common description of a city in Islamic civilization. Interestingly, another thing is generally the majority of slaves, not probably a big majority, but the majority of slaves brought into Islamic civilization were women, which is interesting. It's totally different from the Americas where the majority were men. Another very important, distinct, almost unique, not totally unique, but almost unique feature of Islamic civilization was military slavery. The idea that, and this really begins in the mid 800s, that you, a prince or a ruler or a caliph or a sultan would have a bodyguard and then, let's say, a core of their army made out of slaves, primarily in the beginning, at least Turkic slaves, because they were raised riding and shooting bows and arrows, who are loyal to you and owned by you. Of course, the problem is that eventually they can decide, we can just get rid of this guy. We're the ones in charge. We have all the weapons. So that's what happens in a lot of different settings in Islamic civilization. Another thing that's very important in Islamic civilization is that slavery is not tied to what we would think of as race in any consistent way. Slavery was tied to race in a number of ways, in a number of times, depending on where you are, when you are, and what the slave is doing. So I said to you before, like a lot of, let's say the slaves who were made up the famous Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and Syria from roughly 1260 to 1517, they were at first mostly Kipchak Turks, so Turks from the kind of northern shore of what today would be the northern shore of the Black Sea. Then later on, most of them were Circassian, but a lot of them were from other places as well. But the bulk were from first Kipchak Turks and then Circassians. The Ottoman armies, the core unit of the Janissaries, were Balkans, or from Christians from the Balkans or from Anatolia. If you, for example, in the Hejaz from roughly the 1500s through the 1800s, the most beautiful women, and therefore the most sought after slave women, were Ethiopian and Somali women. So depending where you were, like if you were in Baghdad in 1000 and you just said slave, the assumption is that person is either Persian or Turkic, or actually more common, Slavic. If you were in, let's say, Syria in 1300 and you said slave, probably that person was going to be Slavic, maybe Turkic, maybe African. So it depends where you are and what the job that the slave is doing. And that would tell you probably what their background is. But there's no consistent racialization of slavery in Islamic civilization. Another thing that's very important is because slaves were so often freed, so frequently freed, because so many slaves are women, and a lot of those women ended up having children with their male owners. And those children of those owners were free and of equal standing to their fathers, right? You don't really have the buildup of like a slave population in Islamic civilization. So one of the reasons I think you don't have like a abolitionist movement that emerges amongst slaves in Islamic civilization is because that population is not stable, right?
There's a constant shift of slave to free.
Think about this, right? Why are slaves in the Americas, the Caribbean, or the United States or Brazil, why are they motivated to rebel or to advocate for abolition? One, they're probably never going to be freed, right? So let's take the United States. Through the late 1700s, through the Civil War, the slave owners and advocates of slavery in the U.S. make it more and more difficult to free slaves. So there is increasingly little chance you're ever going to be freed. Two, even if you are freed, you're marked out because you're black, and only black people are enslaved. And you are essentially always vulnerable to re-enslavement, like in 12 Years a Slave. You are, and even let's say you're not going to be re-enslaved, you're always part of the underclass, right? So, and your slaveness, your blackness is always marked out immediately, and is absolutely the fundamental division of life in America, in the United States, right? compare this to, let's just imagine, Cairo in 1700. If you're a slave in Cairo, and let's say you're an African slave, you've been brought from, let's say, what's now southern Sudan, you're probably going to be freed in 5 to 7 years. At which point you can either stay there or you can go back to your homeland, right? If you stay there, you're a free person. You're a free Muslim, just like every other free Muslim. And let's say you're walking down the streets of Cairo and you see someone looks very dark skinned, darker skinned than the average person. This could be a slave, or this could be the son of a very powerful man and his African female slave, who's basically as powerful and rich as his father, right? So that's a free person. This isn't like someone you can mess with. That's a free person. That's like a member of the elite. So if you're walking around the streets of Cairo and you're darker skinned than the average Joe in 1700, you're not going to be re-enslaved. There's skin color doesn't tell anybody who you are, because of this phenomenon of what the great historian Ali Mazrui called ascending miscegenation. The offspring of male slave owners and their female slaves are free. They're not slaves like in the case of Thomas Jefferson. So you have those people go up into the elite population, into the free population. So there's no, you don't get you don't see the accumulation of a population of who's invested in ending the institution of slavery, because it's too transient, and race or phenotype doesn't mark you out as free or slave. So that's just a great.
And even amongst a lot of the former slaves who maybe have remembered their days in slavery, there's not like was there any expression of the moral wrongness of slavery for those
not that I know of, right? I mean, there's one case I can think of which actually doesn't have to do with that specifically, but it has to do with an Ottoman official who basically tells a bunch of Muslims in the Balkans who are upset because their enemy states are like raiding and taking some of their women and men as slaves. This Ottoman official tells them, he's like, well, you don't like this, but you didn't mind when you were taking their women and children, right? So he kind of is like, that's the only, that was in the 1600s. It's one of the Ottoman kind of governors in the Balkans. But he wasn't previously a slave. He was just kind of telling them, he's like, well, you guys, maybe you shouldn't do this to them. But what you do find more often, as far as I know, and again, we're dealing with a very limited amount of data, is people saying, yeah, it sucks to be a slave, but to be honest, any of us, we would want to have our own slaves, because it's tough to do work all by yourself. So it's more like, I don't like being a slave, and one day I'm going to have my own slave. Yeah. Like that's the sentiment you see more often. But again, there's not a lot of data points here. The other thing I was going to say, which is I think it gives you illustrates a difference between kind of the way we think about this in the Americas and the Islamic context, is we talk about like reparations for slaves or descendants of slaves. So one way, and I say this like sort of jokingly, but I think it's actually accurate, was if you wanted to find the descendants of slaves in, let's say, Egypt and Syria, it would be very easy. You go to the wealthiest people, the lightest skinned and wealthiest people, and you give them a bunch of money. Because those are the elites of the Ottoman world from the 1700s to the 1900s were the offspring of free men and Turkic or Circassian or other Caucasian female slaves. So the people who are most easily identifiable as descendants of slaves are actually the elite, which is a very different situation than we would see in the Americas.
Yeah. I mean, to shift gears, I guess, to the crux of the issue here. I mean, obviously, this was an important context to go through, but certainly I'm sure a lot of the listeners are still feeling this uneasiness. I think a lot of Muslims' discussion about the topic of slavery veers into apologetics and describes like, this is like, the milder form of slavery. It's not like plantation slavery that we know of in North America, and a description of some of those realities. But it still never in a way tackles the moral issue of slavery itself. We've talked a little bit about, how Muslims understood it to be a handicap, a not desirable state, and what came out of that. And also, just as a disclaimer, I mean, there's certain issues that we don't have time to fully flesh out, like the issue of slave women, of relations with slave women, or some of the racial consequences of slavery in the Muslim world, which that is the intention, to revisit those in more detail at a later time. But in terms of what you describe in the book, as you move on from this description of slavery in the Muslim world, you talk about what is really the crux of it, which is the conundrum of slavery for us living today in the modern world as Muslims, and as human beings in general. You lay out several statements, statements of what is true. I'll let actually you explain the conundrum in terms of the statements that you posit.
Well, I'm happy that you read the book and remember this concept. So this is what I call the slavery conundrum. And by the way, I mean, what really crystallized this for me, because I remember I was trying to figure out how to write this book. And then in the summer of 2017, I think that's when it was the summer. That's when there were the protests in Charlottesville.
Yes, right.
And Donald Trump gave this speech, then President Donald Trump, maybe future President Donald Trump. I don't know.
Maybe by the time this podcast comes out, who knows?
Hopefully not. I'm going to go in and say I'm not a supporter. So he's, there was this debate about whether or not there should be this statue of Thomas Jefferson at the University of Virginia. Thomas Jefferson was the writer of the Declaration of Independence and said, all men are created equal, et cetera, et cetera. And he was also a slave owner who had children with his slave woman, with his female slave, Sally Heming, right? So if slavery, like the argument of the activists was a very good argument, right? If slavery is an intrinsic and gross moral wrong throughout space and time, slavery was wrong 1,000 years ago, it was wrong 100 years ago, it was wrong 10,000 years ago, whatever, it's always wrong. If that's the case, why do you have a statue to this guy? Makes total sense. Like, I don't care if he did good stuff. Like, if slavery is a monstrosity that only a monster would partake in and support, why would you have a statue to this person? And Donald Trump said something in his speech. It was really interesting argument. He said, well, George Washington was a slave owner. Are you going to take down the statues of George Washington? The kind of implied answer in American political life is no, because George Washington's the founder of the country. He's a hero. He's a great man. Everything's named after him, et cetera, et cetera. George Washington, by the way, was not some, he was not some guy who said, I think slavery is wrong. He owned slaves, and he had one female slave named Ona Judge who ran away when he was in Philadelphia. And he and his wife spent the rest of their lives actually consistently trying to find her and get her back. So he was not some reluctant participant in this. So it's a very good argument. If slavery is a gross and inherent evil throughout space and time, anybody who participates in it or defends it is morally compromised. If, however, so what that means is, as I said before, every religious and philosophical tradition prior to, let's just say, the 1700s, either defended, condoned, accepted slavery, considered slavery natural, one of these. What you're talking about is, if you're talking about toppling statues, you have to basically take the entirety of human heritage prior to, let's just say, 1700. That's being generous too, by the way. Maybe 1800 is better. Maybe 1900 is better, actually. Basically take this and throw it into a garbage can, because it is morally compromised. Now, that if you're kind of a radical activist, or sort of maybe kind of a lot of progressive people would say, yeah, that's fine. That's what we want to do. Okay, fine. That's fine. That's their position. But if you believe that we have our past is some kind of moral source for us, or a legal source for us, a source of wisdom, even binding for us, you can't do that. So what do, right? There's two things you can do. You can either say slavery back then, it was not bad, right? Which means that slavery is not always evil. Sometimes it's okay. Or you can say slavery was not bad then, but it's bad now. Right? So what you say is either back then it was okay. So you have to say that it's not a gross and intrinsic evil throughout space and time. Either you get rid of your heritage or you
unless you're willing to throw away your whole heritage.
Or you change the statement, right? Now it's interesting because when you look at the debates that are going on between abolitionists and not just defenders of slavery, people who just weren't convinced by abolitionist arguments, let's say in the US or let's say take 1790 as a year. There's a fascinating exchange between Benjamin Rush, one of the founding fathers and a signatory of the Declaration of Independence, and a very committed abolitionist, between him and a Southern slave owner. And he says, slavery is evil, et cetera, et cetera. And this Southern slave owner writes, and he says, if slavery is evil, why didn't the Bible prohibit it? And if you say that, well, Jesus wanted to prohibit it, but it would have been too alienating, it would have been too controversial to say that. The guy says, well, are you saying that like the Son of God on earth didn't have the courage to say this is wrong? I mean, that's ridiculous, right? So let's say he can't end it, but he could at least say this is bad. He doesn't say that. In fact, he tells slaves to obey their masters. If you say, well, there's slavery in the Old Testament, but Jesus came and kind of set us on a trajectory to end slavery. We're kind of fulfilling, even centuries later, we'll finally fulfill this mission that he sent us on. Even though he didn't explicitly say it, maybe he just set us ethically on this course. Okay, but if slavery is wrong throughout space and time, why did God allow slavery in the Old Testament? Right. So this is the big problem with the progressive argument. And I mean progressive, even including progressive Muslims. Right. So progressive Muslims might say, the Quran sets us on a trajectory to free slavery, to end slavery. Okay, that's fine. I actually agree. I think it does. But that doesn't solve your problem because you still can't explain why God allowed it ever at any point. So there's no way short of saying, and by the way, this had one of the reasons, I think it's not, I don't know, it's one of the reasons, I don't think it's the most important reason, but it's certainly a factor in what we think of as like liberal theology in Christianity in the West. One of the reasons that many prominent Christian theologians in the late 19th century and 20th century until today don't say that the Bible is somehow the preserved record of God's will to human beings is because if you do that, so if you say that the Bible, Old Testament or New Testament, expresses God's clear will for us in an intact way, you either have to say that slavery was not wrong back then, or that the slavery described in the Bible is good slavery, not bad slavery, which gets you into the whole but slavery isn't that bad in this place, which of course is unacceptable in our society to say. Or you have to say the Bible doesn't really represent in an intact way God's will. It's just, it was for that time. It was kind of a human expression, people who were inspired by God, but they weren't really talking. God wasn't speaking through them. So you can't have a progressive argument. Progressive argument can explain why God wants us not to have slaves, but the progressive argument cannot explain how God ever allowed it in the first place.
Right, and this is how you, when you talk about the conundrum, when you describe about the Muslim conundrum or Islamic slavery conundrum, there's one pro in the sense that, as you mentioned earlier, there's not this. It certainly was not the racialization, systematic racialization. That's a pro, if you want to say a pro, for the Islamic slavery, in the sense that was never part of the institution as it existed in Muslim lands. But the disadvantage, the even further disadvantage for the Islamic slavery conundrum is that, unlike perhaps people of the Judeo-Christian tradition now, Muslims rely on the authority of the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet. So if you are going to, you are really stuck as a Muslim. If you want to be a confessional practicing Muslim, you cannot in any way state anything to the line of what you're describing of some of the
definitely. And I mean, it's interesting that the same thing, Muslims get really upset when you talk about this, because progressive Muslims get really upset because they don't have an answer for that. And when people are confronted with this, by the way, like Donald Trump said, I mean, if you really think that slavery was an evil throughout space and time, you should tear down all the statues of George Washington and rename everything that's named after George Washington. If not, then you need to tell me how you understand this, because what you're not really being consistent.
Yeah, where's the line? Right?
Yeah. Either you're saying it was okay back then, or it was not, the slavery that was practiced back then wasn't that bad, or what? I mean, there's no other options. So yeah, people tend to get really stressed out about this because it brings up a contradiction in people's minds, in the values they have, their kind of commitments, and people don't like that. So, I mean, I've had a lot of Muslims, young Muslims come to me and say, if I can't say slavery is absolutely wrong throughout space and time, I can't be Muslim. And I just say to them, like, okay. I mean, I don't argue with them because I don't want to provoke a crisis in their faith,
right.
But you can see in the way they're looking at the issue that they are they're a walking case of cognitive dissonance.
I mean, certainly this is a tension that I think, it's motivated you yourself to explore the issue. It's a reason why, I decided to read your book and talk about it with you today. I mean, even if we're going to, there is a tension there, which is, I think, for a lot of our listeners share that same tension in terms of reconciling, our modern sensibilities with the reality of what our tradition is.
So, I mean, one of the ways I deal with it is to say, like, first of all, if you're American, the debate over slavery is in effect about American slavery. I have no problem condemning slavery in the Americas. Right? There's a reason why people started to really talk about the immorality of slavery in the context of the North Atlantic slave trade. There's a reason why, right? So people who knew, like, so for example, Bartolomé de las Casas in the 1500s, who's one of the first people who really starts talking about the horrors of slavery in the Americas. He was from Spain. There were slaves in Spain. He thought it was like mellow. He just didn't care. The stuff he saw in the Americas shocked him. Was shocking to his conscience. At that time, by the way, it was Native Americans who were enslaved there in the Spanish colonies of the Americas. So when you read the descriptions of early critics of slavery, it's interesting. The earliest criticisms of slavery that are written in the Americas in the late 1600s and the early 1700s all come from people who have direct experience with the slave trade. They see stuff and they are horrified. Now, I don't know of anybody who writes like that in the Muslim tradition prior to the modern period, right? So there's a couple of things. One, the level of violence in the transatlantic slave trade was enormous. I mean, it was like unbelievably violent. It was so violent that there were hundreds of mutinies aboard slave ships going from West Africa to the Americas. Hundreds over a 350-year period. To the point that ships were built with internal defenses against slave uprisings amongst enslaved people from West Africa. It was unbelievably violent. If you read the descriptions written by slave overseers in, let's say, Jamaica in the 1700s, if you read them, or anywhere, so they had places like the British colonies of the Caribbean, South Carolina. In a lot of places, the black slave population was like 90%. It's like 9-to-1 black slaves to white overseers or owners. That ratio in Islamic civilization is insane. You just don't. It's extremely rare if it ever happens. When you have this situation, the only way that these white owners can manage these people is to terrorize them with, violence that is. I'm a pretty like cold guy. Like I can talk about nasty stuff all the time. I don't get affected by it, but I can't even say the stuff that is written by these people about what they do to slaves. It's horrific. So that when you see that, and you see, by the way, that like essentially 1 out of 12 people are dying on the ships just to begin with. I think about 1 out of 12, if I'm not mistaken. Violence on the ships, violence against slaves. The fact that it's all black people, right? This is a traffic that is totally racialized. It is justified by the fact that these people are non-Christian, essentially lower forms of human beings who can be enslaved. And like a lot of people are like, this is really demented. And that's where you start seeing the major criticisms. It's not really about slavery per se. It's about this slavery. And then it expands from there.
We just earlier were describing sort of the practice of slavery as a whole. Obviously with exceptions, there's exceptions everywhere. The diversity of Muslim lands in the Muslim civilization, right? And without delving in, I don't think this necessarily means we're delving into apologetics here, but it is, I think, important to know the context of what slavery as existed in the Muslim world was compared to the generality of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in North America. The reason being is because I want to move into sort of our final sort of topic in the book, which is Muslim abolitionism or abolition of slavery, because understanding where that movement comes from requires an understanding of the context that they were living in. It was not the context of this horrific, as what you just described in North American plantation slavery. It was in a completely different context. So with that being said, let's sort of describe a little bit about some of the avenues that were that led to Muslim scholars and Muslim areas to consider abolishing slavery, if we're going to use the modern terms. I mean, we had, Dr. Bilal Ware back in episode 9, we went through his book, The Walking Quran, and he described Abdul Qadir Khan and the abolitionists of slavery in that area in that predated the 1800s, right? And I would just tell listeners, please listen to that episode 9 with Bilal Ware, and that's one place where this wave of abolition, it came about. Describe a little bit about the avenues that Muslims took in terms of reconciling the authority of the Quran and the Sunnah with the desire to fully eradicate slavery in their societies.
Okay, so first of all, there's a huge debate amongst Western scholars, academics, about how abolitionism emerges. There are essentially two arguments. One is what you might call the moral awakening argument. Well, there's 3 arguments, right? So one is what you might call the moral awakening argument, which is actually kind of comical when you hear it, right? It's basically human beings. There's all these great human beings. There's Moses, Jesus, Buddha,
right.
St. Augustine, right? All these people, right? At some point, Europeans, of course, because Europeans are the greatest, they wake up one day and they say, oh my God, slavery is wrong. Let it be known, go forth and proclaim it in the city. Slavery is wrong. That's what happens. It's like it's just that the Western genius comes to this understanding and goes and tells us to the rest of the world. That's actually the argument. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that's our modern sensibilities today, is that we just think we've evolved.
Kind of ridiculous, right? If you think about it. So I mean, what? People somehow getting more protein in their diet or something? They're getting higher IQs? No evidence of this. The second argument is, we could call it like the economic argument, which is that people need slaves to engage in labor. Aristotle says this in his Politics. He says, there will be slaves until looms, looms that like make cloth, until looms move themselves, there will be slaves. That's actually totally correct, right? What happened? Suddenly you have technology, industrial revolution, by which, where does the first opposition to slavery emerge? In Britain and in the British colonies in North America. Two places in which industrialization first started, and which there were massive accumulation of wealth gotten through non-slavery means. The northern colonies of the Americas, not the southern colonies not like the American South, the American North and Britain. Industrialization develops, wealth accumulates based on non-slave industries, slave-based industries. Is that coincidence? So the argument is basically the first people in human history who really realize you don't need slaves and we can get rich without them, they're the people who start to talk about slavery as a problem. They essentially have the luxury. I mean, imagine, you could talk about it as sort of like, it's like, I was watching this documentary about like the Taliban the other day. It was just filming in Afghanistan. It's really interesting. And you have these stories of like, I became a vegetarian when I went, we had this lamb and we raised into a sheep and then we killed him and I became a vegetarian because I was horrified. How could we? This was my friend and now I eat it. And you have this picture of this like Afghan kid who's like, does that and he just gets the head of the sheep. He's like, hey, look, I have the head of my sheep, and they're eating it because if you need meat to live, you don't have a emotional, like this is not emotional conflict for you. It's a luxury conflict, right? It's a luxury conflict. So the first people who have the luxury to think morally about this, think morally about it. That's the kind of economic argument. The third argument, which is essentially mixes these two, which I think is correct, which says that the beginning of this starts with people who are in the economic position in the North Atlantic, in Britain and the Northern Americas, to have the capacity to engage in labor and economics and wealth accumulation without slaves. It happens to be that the slavery that is around them is absolutely horrific, right? Amongst the worst in human history. And so the trigger, right? They are not only now able to think about this being immoral, but presented with compelling evidence that it is immoral. Once their arguments start to be successful in their own societies, it feeds into this idea that we are in an era of moral progress where we are realizing things are wrong that previously people didn't think were wrong. And we are able to improve the world. The world is getting better. If the world is getting better, if we can actually change things and make things better, that kind of reinforces your motivation to engage in abolition. And then reinforces your motivation to go and bring this to other people, to sort of spread your message to other people, because you see the world can be changed, right? So that's, I think, the correct argument. It's a combination of economics and the moral possibility created by economics. Economics and by the way, I won't just say economics, technology. This is very important. Technology and the moral possibilities created by technology, and then the moral certainties that emerge in the wake of that. And when I say technology, I think is a useful example is, one example I think is very helpful to as a kind of analogy is showering. So, I mean, I was just talking to my friend who grew up in a Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon. He's about my age. He grew up, you took one shower a week. On Friday, you took one shower a week. And I just want to imagine, you're on the metro. It's a crowded day on the metro, and you're next to somebody who takes one shower a week. What do you think about that person? Let me tell you what goes through my head. This is a filthy person. This guy stinks. What is this? Like he's probably from one of these like awful countries, or people who are like backward, and it's like filthy people. Like they don't, we're like much more civilized than these people. In fact, there's no, there's all these moral implications to what I'm saying and kind of moral conclusions I'm drawing. But actually, it just has to do with whether or not someone has access to water or access to hot water. Are they actually disgusting? No, we are getting confused between technological availability and, economic plenty and morality. So a lot of our moral certainty about slavery is real. When you ask me about slavery, I'm disgusted. That's I'm not making that up. That's a legitimate feeling of a person who's raised in North America, in Washington, D.C., in the 1980s and 90s and 2000s, right? That's how people are going to think. That's 100% sincere. But that doesn't mean that that's because I've tapped into some kind of vein of moral truth that previous human beings didn't realize. It just means that I live in a world where this institution is not necessary, right? So, just by the way, when you listen to strict animal rights activists talk about eating meat and stuff, they use the language of abolition. They say that we want to abolish the slavery of animals. Think about, what do? We take animals, we raise them in cages, we keep them in cages, then we eat them. That's on what basis do we do this? Because we don't do this to other human beings. We do this to except for Homo sapiens, it's okay to do this to other animals, except for dogs for some reason, because we like them, right? Strict animal rights activists say, you guys are just speciesist. And we ha, that's really funny. That's speciesist. No, they mean that. Why, on what basis do you say that Homo sapiens cannot be eaten, cannot be caged and kept as slaves, but cows can? On what basis? It's just based on what species you're from. So if we get it to a point where humans no longer need animal products, we can live very well without them and more easily without them. We'll look back at the time when we ate meat, you and I today, and people will just laugh at it. They'll be like, these people were barbarians. Why did they not have our moral awareness? It's not about moral awareness. It's just, this is technologically, economically not feasible for most people. A lot of people in the world need meat to survive, right? It's very important to remember that when people talk about slavery or abolition in an Islamic world, abolition didn't, it's not like people knew slavery was wrong and Muslims just didn't get it. Nobody talked about slavery being wrong in world history per se, except I've mentioned 4 or 5 people in human history prior to the, let's say, 1700s. This was every slavery that every society, every civilization, and most societies that we know of had slaves, something that we would consider slavery. None of them ever even mooted the idea of abolishing this. Okay? The first people who think about this idea in Britain and the industrial north of the British American colonies don't do so because they're Christians or something, or because they're possessed the Greco-Roman heritage. Because Western Europeans have been Christian for 1600 years or whatever, for over a millennium, and had the Greco-Roman heritage for over a millennium, and this didn't occur to them. So it's not about being Christian or being Western or something like that. It's being in a specific place with certain technologies that become available and the economic and moral possibilities that those technologies allow. And Muslims, if the Industrial Revolution had started in, let's say, Cairo or Baghdad or something, Muslims would have been the first people to come up with the idea of abolishing slavery. In fact, they would be more fitting for them to, because the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet are absolutely obsessed with the idea of emancipation. So, how do Muslims encounter abolitionism or the idea of getting rid of slavery? They encounter it the same way they encounter modernity, namely through either European diplomatic contact with European powers who are stronger than them, or through colonialization. So that's how Muslims encounter the idea of abolition. Let me just run quickly through the different schools of thought Muslims have. the most radical argument and end with the least radical argument. Okay, so argument number one, slavery was always wrong in Islam. This was the argument made by the famous Indian Islamic modernist Sir Sayyid Ahmed Khan, died 1898. He says, the hadiths that talk about slavery are forged, they're not reliable. The Quran emphasizes emancipation. And he says, by the way, it's interesting, he says the Quranic verses that actually talk about enslavement, I think it's Surah Muhammad, when it says, وَإِذَا لَقَيْتُمُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا فَضَرْبُ الرِّقَابِ حَتَّى إِذَا أَثْخَنْتُمُوهُمْ فَشَدُّوا الْوَثَاقِ فَإِمَّا مَنًّا مِنْ بَعْدُ إِمَّا فِدَاءً, right? So if you encounter those people who are the unbelievers, fight them until you defeat them, and then bind them firmly, the prisoners firmly, then either release them just for free, just let them go, or ransom them back to their families, their side. It doesn't say, or keep them as slaves. So what Sayyid Ahmed Khan says is, the Quran actually doesn't allow slavery. The Quran allowed the slavery that existed at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, but then ended it and didn't allow anymore. That's his argument. Now, the upside of the argument is, it turns out the Quran ended slavery, according to Sir Sayyid Ahmed Khan. The downside is, all those hadiths you like, gone. The entirety of Islamic tradition, it was a big mistake, okay? The other problem is, and this is kind of subtle, but I think important, is he actually can't say that slavery was always morally abhorrent, because the Quran doesn't say that. The Quran, according to him, allows slavery, that existing slavery, to continue, and then doesn't allow any more. If, in fact, it was morally abhorrent, the Quran should have said, according to him, according to his argument, not according to, he doesn't say this, but according to his argument, the Quran should have said, slavery is morally wrong, immediately cease. But it doesn't. So that's first argument. The second argument is, you could maybe call it the, Muslims went off the rails argument.
Yes, right.
Okay. The second argument, and this you see first developed by Islamic modernists like Rashid Rida, who died in 1935, and other figures, and it's very common after that. The idea is, look, slavery was too economically important and too economically omnipresent to end. Just like that, you can't do it. And by the way, what Rashid Rida says is, we saw what happens when you try to end slavery by fiat, by executive decision in America, and they had a civil war. So it's interesting. He says, the civil war is actually what we don't want to happen.
Okay.
So what he says is, the Quran comes, encourages manumission, closes the doors on slavery except capture through war. So basically, you're going to have a very small amount of slaves coming in, a lot of slaves going out, and it's going to die out on its own. That was the Quranic mission, or the Quranic kind of intention. But Muslims went off the rails, and instead of doing that, they just started to enslave lots of people. And so that was a mistake in Islamic civilization. The good side, the upside of this argument is, you can say slavery is wrong. The bad side is, a lot of Islamic civilization was kind of errant.
Mm-hmm.
But at least you retain, the fiqh traditions and stuff were wrong on this issue, but you retain the Quran, you retain the Sunnah of the Prophet, but you don't get the ability to say that slavery was always wrong throughout space and time, because if it had been, why didn't the Quran say this or something, right? But this is very similar to similar arguments being made by Christian and Jewish scholars at that time, and made until today by a lot of Christian and Jewish scholars.
Yeah.
The next argument over is the maqasid al-Sharia argument, the aims of the Sharia argument. This is, in my opinion, unquestionably correct. This is, whether or not you think the other ones are correct or not is another issue, but this one is definitely correct, which is to say that freeing slaves is one of the aims of the Sharia. And sure enough, when you go back and you look at earliest hadith collections, earliest works of fiqh, the idea that God wants freedom, the way in which the Quran and the Sunnah are obsessed with emancipation, the way that even in Islamic transaction and contract law, You constantly have regular rules subverted to emphasize freeing slaves. And go back to like text, let's say a Shatibi in the 1300s, who writes, one of the first people to talk about maqasid in a really systematic way. He says, one of the maqasid of the Sharia is itq, freeing slaves. And so basically, we are now in a position where slavery there's no reason to have it. It's not economically essential. So by just the best way to fulfill this aim of the Sharia is simply to end the institution of slavery. And you're allowed to do that, right? Because a ruler has what's called the power of taqyid al-mubah, or restricting permissible. So a Muslim ruler can say, you can't drive faster than 55 miles an hour. You can only drive on the right side of the road. You can't build your house using asbestos, right? So these are all things that are not prohibited in the Quran and the Sunnah, but the Muslim state or Muslim government or any government has the right to restrict these things for the best interests of the community. So Muslims don't have to have slaves. So the ruler can simply say, no more slaves, because this is the aim of the Sharia. Next argument over is if you can't do it right, you can't do it at all argument. And this is the argument used by Ahmed Bey in Tunisia in his famous 1846 Abolition Declaration, right, where he says, no more everyone in Tunisia is free, no more slaves brought into the country. What he says is, too many of the slaves that you guys are bringing in are actually originally Muslims. You can't even tell the difference between who's Muslim and who's not. In addition, people are mistreating their slaves. They're not living up to the Sharia requirements for how slaves should be treated. No one can do this right. No more slavery. And again, it's within the ruler's right to do this.
Right.
If the ruler says, no more fasting, no more praying, that's not allowed. But if the ruler says no more driving over 55 miles an hour, no more having slaves, that's allowed. These things are not required. Right. The next argument over is the, let's just say, remit of the ruler argument. This argument says slavery is ultimately falls under the purview of the Muslim ruler. For example, when you have a bunch of prisoners of war, what do? Do you ransom them? Do you free them? Do you keep them as slaves? This is the ruler's decision. Do you sign a treaty with your neighbor saying we will not enslave any of your people and you won't enslave any of our people? Ruler can do that. Do you sign a treaty saying we're not going to buy any more slaves at all and we're going to get rid of all our slaves? This is all up to the ruler. The ruler can do this based on what he or she or whatever the government thinks is the best interests of the community. The next argument over, and now we're getting into maybe a little bit less comfortable, is the bad PR argument. It's not that slavery is really wrong. It's just that it's a really bad PR, right? So don't, and this is in fact, Bin Baz was asked this, Muhammad Salih ibn Uthaymeen was asked this, rahimahullah. He died in 2001, by one of his students, who's actually an American Muslim scholar, asked him this question about, can Muslims, let's say fighting in Bosnia in the 1990s, can they take, let's say, Serbians captives, can they take them as slaves? And Ibn Uthaymeen said, technically yes, but we need international support on this issue. So it's really bad. It's a bad image. Don't do it. It's a politically bad idea. So it's a politically bad idea.
Yeah.
The last argument is, what are you talking about? And this is like people like Sheikh Al-Albani, rahimahullah, died in 1999, made this argument. Why do you care a bunch of kuffar, unbelievers, telling you about slavery is wrong, all this stuff like that? Follow the Quran and the Sunnah. What are you thinking? These people are, they're weird racial slavery in the North Atlantic and their plantations. These people are all awful human beings. Don't worry about them. You have your tradition, which is ethical and only wants good for the slave and the master, etc. This is what he argued. Mm-hmm. So he said this is just a distraction to get into this moral debate. So that's the full range of Muslim arguments and just points of view on the issue of abolition.
Did any of those arguments, did anyone take hold more than the other that led to the eventual abolition of slavery?
Eventually, right, slavery is abolished in the Islamic world, or the Muslim world, because Muslim rulers, beginning in the sort of 1870s is the best time. Maybe actually really 1840s, if you think about Ahmed Bey in Tunisia, start to restrict more and more the import of slaves. And then end slavery or just don't recognize it legally anymore. And people really start to see it as something that is, unacceptable. And one thing that's helpful in this regard, the same thing happens to Muslims as happened to people in North America and Britain.
Right.
And eventually, they go through the same kind of moral journey on the basis of what is possible for them economically and technologically and things like that. Another thing I would say it's important to remember is, I always had this idea that like slavery, if you look at slavery in, let's say, the Mediterranean or Indian Ocean world of Islam was, it sort of would like gradually go down, down, down. It was like decrease until the modern period. That's actually not true. It spiked in the 1800s. So slavery and slave raiding across the Sahara and in East Africa, and even in Muslim lands like Yemen and Balochistan and things like that, and the capture of people coming to Hajj, Indonesian pilgrims coming to Hajj, African pilgrims coming to Hajj, getting grabbed and taken as slaves in the late 19th century. In the early 20th century, peaked. It was a huge problem. It was unprecedented. So one of the reasons that Muslims start having, like in Egypt and Syria and places like that, start having extreme, they start writing against slavery and enslavement of people in that time period, isn't just because they're influenced by Europeans. It's because there is now a blight of enslavement of people who you cannot legally enslave that is unseen before. So that's another reason is people start seeing stuff that actually had not been practiced before.
Right. So, as we close here, I would advise all the listeners to read your book because you go into all this in a lot of detail. But as a way to sort of move towards a conclusion here, and if you permit, I'd like to ask you personally, in sense like, what brings you certainty, what brings you comfort as someone who professes as a practicing Muslim who believes in the authority of the Quran, the authority of the way and the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ. What brings you to a comfort and certainty there by upholding those sources, but also believing that slavery today is wrong?
I would say that, first of all, to know that the disgust I feel in my stomach when I think about slavery, that's true. Like that's real. There's not faulty programming in my brain or something, right? But that doesn't mean that anybody who didn't have that feeling in human history is somehow morally less than I am or something like that, right? I have this feeling the same way I have the feeling about the guy in the metro who's only showering once a week because of the specific customary world in which I live. And custom is really important in Islamic law. Most of the details of the Sharia are based on custom. That's fine. As long as how is a husband supposed to act towards his wife? How is a wife supposed to act towards his husband? This is based on custom. So custom is morally real. That's a very important part of our moral lives. So to say that this is based on kind of technology and change and customs and different moral realizations, there's nothing that doesn't minimize those moral feelings and that doesn't delegitimize them in Islamic terms. No, they're totally legitimate. Think about how much the Quran says ma'ruf, ma'ruf, ma'ruf. Right. Your ma'ruf is what is known to be right. That's the first thing. Second, to know that, I actually find it comforting to know that human history is a much bigger place than just Western European sensibilities, Western urban sensibilities in the late 20th and early 21st century. Guess what? Just because you happen to live in New York City or Washington, D.C. in 2023 and you think something's right or wrong, doesn't mean everyone in world history thought that.
Yeah.
Right? And, you might be the one with a bad argument, not them. Yeah. So I think I find it comforting to know that human history and the experience of our species is much broader than what I know. And that if you want to talk about, if you really respect human beings, not just ones that think like you have to be willing to think in wider terms than we're normally used to. Right? So I I find that comforting because it means that when things don't make sense to me, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with the world. It just means that not everything makes sense to everybody. We can't understand the sentiments of people who lived in different times and places than us because they lived in very different situations. That doesn't mean they're morally less than us or we're morally superior to them. Finally, I would say that the last thing is the idea of it was unquestionably, and I don't care if you're some super skeptical Orientalist who thinks the Quran was written in 800 and every hadith was written in 900 and it was all some kind of conspiracy, right? There is no reading of the Quran or the Sunnah of the Prophet. There is no historical understanding of these sources that can not conclude that these sources were absolutely obsessed with emancipation, the freeing of slaves, that they encouraged it more than any other pre-modern document I've ever seen. And that it was one of the aims of the Sharia to emancipate people. And that if the best way to emancipate people in our modern day and age is for rulers and states to top down end the institution of slavery, that's great. We support that 100%. That is a 100% Muslim mandate.
I just wanted to close with, what directly from your book, which I feel sort of summarizes what you just said in terms of reconciling our relationship with the past and with, the tradition. You basically talk about Muslim abolition. You say it was programmatically baked into the Sharia's internal logic and functioning, reaffirmed and applied ceaselessly for over a millennium. If the Sharia tradition did not elevate maximizing freedom to a main aim of the Sharia until the 20th century, and if Islamic civilization did not universalize its drive to emancipate or call for ending slavery as an institution, it was because none of this was or had ever been conceivable anywhere to anyone. You say this towards the end of the book, but
I couldn't have said it better myself.
What you've done in this is give us the tools to be able to try to reconcile some of this tension that we may have, certainly with the tradition, and be confident moving forward as Muslims in, like as we said in the beginning, like me, be able to read our text and not feel a discomfort that may indicate that a concern that we're not certain in our faith and certain in our tradition. So inshallah, I hope this is like the first of a series of conversations that I can have about this topic. Remember to check out Al-Madina.org for the latest programs and also the latest episodes. And inshallah, till the next time, we'll see you then. Assalamu alaikum.
Islam.
On the next episode of the ImanWire podcast.
The tradition is a series of choices. The tradition is open to interpretation. The tradition is open to manipulation by the forces of reaction and conservatism and empire and oppression. And the tradition is also open to interpretation that is radical and revolutionary and emancipatory. And a healthy, sound, thriving heart that has taken its place and dislodged the ego, put that tyrant in his place, and has become a humble servant, is going to have the inner discernment and understanding that is going to bring forth that which sets humanity free from internal oppressors and external oppressors. Because ultimately, that's how I read the Quran, that's how I understand what the Sunnah of the Messenger, alayhi abdul salatu wasalam, was, is that he came, peace be upon him, with the most complete set of armaments to free humanity from all internal and external oppressors.